This is a talk given to the Westbury branch of the Wiltshire Family History Society in November 2020 to mark the 400th anniversary of the sailing of the Mayflower from Plymouth to New Plymouth. My interest began when I was just 7 years of age, watching the Mayflower II, Mayflower II sail along part of the Cornish coast with my grandmother. Also, growing up in Plymouth, the story of the Mayflower was part and parcel of the history of the city. And so therefore I was very familiar with the story at that point. Then for 20 years, I taught in Nottinghamshire. And although I never went to Scrooby itself, I was always aware of the links between that county and the Mayflower. And then fourthly, 5 years ago, my wife and myself went to New England to visit relatives. And we took the opportunity to go to Plymouth Plantation and Mayflower II at that time. And then I suppose also, I've always had an interest in nonconformist history. I suppose if we're British, like Danny Dyer, we would love to go back and make the links in our family tree with British royalty. We'd be really chuffed if we could do that. And likewise, those born in America would love to do the same with the Mayflower. There's something about the story which really grips people, I suppose, on both sides of the Atlantic. So what was special about this voyage? What was so special about this colony that was started? Now, those on board the Mayflower as it sailed in 1620 were of three types. First of all, of course, there was the crew, mainly based, as you can see, in red in Harwich, north of London. Then there were the pilgrims, those who belonged to a particular sect of Christians called the Separatists, and I'll explain more about them in a minute. And by and large, they were on the east side of the country. And then there were others who weren't there for religious purposes, but more in terms of exploring this new opportunity that was opening up. And they were arranged by the merchant adventurers. And as you can see from the map, in many ways, they're more general. Their distribution is more general than those of the pilgrims. The pilgrims provided the key group of passengers that were on board the Mayflower. And here's the names of those the pilgrims who were on board. The key ones was William Bradford, William Brewster, John Carver right at the top, and then towards the bottom, or at the bottom, there's Edward Winslow. Also on that list, you can see whereabouts they came from. And as a family historian, if those names, if those surnames are relevant to you and your family background, and especially with regarding to the places that are based, then you never know, you might be connected with them in some way or other. Now, these pilgrims, as you can see, didn't actually set out from England. They set out from Leiden in Holland. And again, I'll explain why in a moment. And they also had servants. And I think this is one of the saddest pages that I'm showing in this presentation, because just look at the ages of those who are going with them as servants. And one family in particular, the Moore family, who came from Shipton in Shropshire. Why were they there? Why were they servants? What was the connection? Maybe they were just on the poor list of certain parishes, you know, as in Shipton. With their ages, the oldest one, Ellen. And what happened to her? She died literally within days of arriving in the New World. Then there was her brother, Jasper, just 7 years of age. And he died. He didn't even move ashore, didn't go ashore. He died on board the ship in December. Of the four, Richard was the only one who survived, and he was age 6. And by the ages, it looks as possibly he was twin to Mary, or certainly was born in the same same year. Mary, she died within 3 months of them arriving there. You know, that poor sad family. But then there were these merchant adventurers who had been organized by, or the opportunity was made available to them to go by Thomas Weston of the London Merchant Adventurers. And you know, the names here, in terms of Wiltshire, I suppose the nearest families was the Eaton family, who came from Bristol, and then the Hopkins, Stephen and Elizabeth Hopkins, and their family, who came from Upper Clapford. Stephen had actually been to the New World before. He had travelled to Jamestown. Presumably he had come back to Britain to collect his family. And Oceanus, he was born on that voyage as they sailed across the Atlantic. And at the bottom, again, there's a Winslow, Gilbert, who was brother of Edward, who was part of the separatist group. And they also had servants. And we don't know what ages they were. It says they're under 21. Now, they could have been the same age as the Moore children, or they could have been older. And then I suppose, you know, this last group, many of which we don't know the names of, the crew, about 30, estimated numbers 30. And half of them died there because of the late arrival of the Mayflower in the New World. The ship had to stay until the spring. It wasn't worth trying to travel back straight away. And so the only names of those involved with it was Captain Jones and some of the others there. There's the ship's surgeon and so on, but mainly the officers are the only ones that we know the names of. But when I was 7 years of age, I stood with my nan, my grandmother, at a place called Freethy. Now, if you think about a map of Plymouth in relationship to Cornwall, there's Plymouth with the River Tamar. Then there's this headland in Cornwall called Rame Head, and then there's a sweeping bay which goes right around to Loo. Well, just inside that bay is Freethy, where there's still chalets there on the edge of it, in a couple of fields at the top of the cliff. In those days, my grandmother owned it. It's now, this particular chalet is now belongs to my brother. And we stood there one afternoon watching. We saw it come around the headland, the Mayflower Second. We saw it come around the headland and then sail along the horizon. Now, I couldn't take pictures, didn't take any pictures. And so I've created a picture for you to look at. Obviously, the Mayflower did not go as fast as that. We watched it off and on for several hours until it got to the evening and got dark. Went to bed, got up the next morning, and it had gone further down the coast. Okay. Those who were the pilgrims, the key group came from this area of Nottinghamshire, Yorkshire, and Lincolnshire, around Scrooby. Initially, I suppose the most important guy who was part of this group was William Brewster. He was the elder, one of the leaders of the group, and he was the postmaster at Scrooby, living in the manor house. And whether the manor house, the pictures at the bottom of the page, was the place where they worshipped, I don't know, but certainly that's where he lived. Someone who became more important later on was William Bradford from Austerfield in Yorkshire. At this stage, he was just a young man. It was John Robinson who came from Sturton-le-Steeple, again in Nottinghamshire. If you look at where it says 620, just to the right of that is Sturton-le-Steeple. And he'd been an Anglican priest. And the fourth, I suppose, most important person from this group was Richard Clifton, who came from Gainsborough in Lincolnshire. And Robinson and Clifton especially were the pastors, were the preachers in the group. So why were they called separatists? And the answer is very simple. The fact that they saw themselves as being separate from the church and the bishops. They didn't see themselves under the authority of the Church of England. And because they'd separated themselves from the church, having their own meetings, they were deemed to be denying the king. Why? Because of the close link between royalty, government, and church. And so to deny one, i.e. the church, they were denying the government of the land and also the monarchy. And of course, at this stage, the king was James I, James VI of Scotland. And just to show us how much they felt at this time, how much they felt in fear. When the Brewsters had a little girl in 1606, they called her Fear. And I think that just shows what sort of life was like for them, not sure what was going to happen, and certainly didn't feel as though they were at home in their own land. And so in 1607, the same year that Jamestown was established in Virginia, things began to happen to this congregation that had grown in size in this area. First of all, William Brewster was sacked as the postmaster. Why? Because of his religious belief. And they really felt this fear, this persecution. As I said before, James I saw them as a threat to his authority as king. And because of that, although there was a place of refuge for nonconformists, which is Holland, legal emigration was not possible for these separatists because they required a royal permit. And to be honest with you, James I would not give a permit to those who he saw as the enemy. So what were they to do? How were they going to get to Holland? How were they going to escape this persecution that they were facing? And so they began to just quietly sell the properties, gather together their few possessions that they wanted to take with them, plus their money. And they fled on foot the 60 miles to Boston on the Lincolnshire coast in order to find passage. Now, we're very aware of the plight of the boat people who tried to get to the United Kingdom at this present time and also other countries. And you know, how they are treated, how they are cheated as well by those who are providing the means for them to get there. And to be honest, the same thing was happening in 1607, that a ship's captain agreed to smuggle them aboard, but double-crossed them. And in the end, many of them ended up in prison. They were all released, except for the pastors, for those in charge, William Brewster and the two pastors, Clifton and Robinson. But then they were able, as they were released, they made all of these pilgrims made their own way to Holland, and eventually the leaders were freed so that they could join them as well. And so this congregation from the Scrooby area found themselves in Holland, in Amsterdam. But unfortunately, they found themselves in disagreement with other English religious refugees. You know, there were other groups, you know, one that was notable at this time, at the beginning of the 17th century, were the Anabaptists. And so they moved again, they moved on to Leiden. But even that wasn't to their liking, because, we're talking about Puritans here, and they just found life in Leiden just too frivolous, and therefore it is a moral danger to their children. And with the opening of the New World with Jamestown, many within this group started to think about actually founding a colony of their own in this opening world, in this new world, in this new England beyond the sea, where they could establish what they saw as Christian principles. Of those leaders, of those pastors, Richard Clifton actually died in 1616. And when it came to the time of them making that journey from Holland to the New World, John Robinson, the other main pastor, actually stayed in Leiden. He didn't go with them and actually died there a few years later. Believe it or not, there wasn't one ship in this story, but two. And the first ship was the Speedwell. And this was purchased in Holland by the Pilgrims, by the Separatists. Just 60, a very small ship, just 60 tons. And 46 of the congregation made the journey from Holland back to England, back to Southampton. And they set sail from Holland on the 22nd of July, 1620, on board the Speedwell. And there they were going to meet another ship. And of course, this other ship was the Mayflower. And this was the ship that was chartered by Thomas Weston and the merchant adventurers. And as it says there, the part owner captain was Christopher Jones. And so these two ships were going in convoy. They were given a rough place of where they had to arrive at in the New World. And because it was the merchant adventurers who were organizing it, then the Speedwell with the Puritans, with the Pilgrims on board, could accompany them. And when they got there, they found the Mayflower, and on board were members of another separatist congregation from Southwark in London. But there were also those who had been arranged by the merchant adventurers to be there as well. They were already on board the Mayflower. Altogether, on board the Mayflower were 90 people. And so the two ships set sail on the 15th of August, 1620, from Southampton. Altogether, 136 passengers, thinking, right, Southampton to the New World, to North Virginia. Off we go. Unfortunately, the Speedwell sprung a leak, and therefore they had real trouble on board the Puritan, the Pilgrim ship. They stopped at Dartmouth so that the Speedwell could be rendered seaworthy. And as far as they were concerned, it was all sorted out. It was ready to sail again. And so they set off again to go across the Atlantic. And as it says there, they went with renewed hope. But as they got past Ireland, it was reported that the boat was still leaking. And they had to make a decision. Do they carry on or do they return to England? And the decision was taken that they had to return to England, not to Southampton or Dartmouth, but to Plymouth. And that's why The Mayflower went from Old Plymouth in Devonshire to New Plymouth in Massachusetts. The Speedwell was just in no shape to carry on with that journey. Now, what were they going to do? They had so many people, 130 odd or more, 140-ish. And so some decided that they would back out the venture, possibly the Southwark congregation, and return to the capital. And so on the 5th of September in 1620, just the Mayflower set off towards the New World with 75 males, 29 female passengers, 30 at least were just children. And that's why Plymouth is where the Mayflower Steps are, the place where the Mayflower sailed from the United Kingdom. And the city takes great pride in the fact that we have the Mayflower Steps there, down at the Barbican in Plymouth. And there's a picture painting by Bernard Gribble of the Mayflower setting sail from Plymouth. And it looks like Drake's Island behind the ship. The ship, which was described by someone as a sweet ship. And that's why across America today, there are so many places with the name of Plymouth. Not just New Plymouth in Massachusetts, but several others as well. But what a journey it was. What a voyage. In many ways, that picture sums up what they faced. The journey should have been taken earlier in the year, but because of delays and goodness knows what, they were so late in actually setting off. Many were violently seasick. They were tossed around just like a cork. The passengers were forced to remain below deck for days on end. Just think of the situation in the hold with people spewing up all over the place. It was a dreadful voyage for all of them. One guy, John Howland, nearly lost his life. He was just grabbed before falling overboard. Young Oceanus Hopkins was born on the voyage. On the other hand, William Button from Austerfield, one of that original congregation, died 3 days before arriving in Cape Cod. And so 9 weeks after leaving Plymouth, Captain Jones sailed the Mayflower around the tip of Cape Cod and dropped anchor in the sheltered waters that it provided. And this was named Provincetown Harbor. And there's a picture of Massachusetts, and just look at the names. Yes, over in the middle, there's Springfield. I know it's spelt wrongly there, but it's supposed to be Springfield. Where the Simpsons come from, although there are numerous Springfields across the states, a bit like Plymouth. There's New Bedford, there's Taunton, there's Boston, there's Worcester. Notice the English names given. Boston, I suppose, is significant. In fact, that when the Pilgrims set off to leave Britain in 1607, they left from Boston. And a close-up of Cape Cod. You can see where the ship first stopped, November the 11th. Shows you where they had the first encounter with the Native Americans. Shows you where New Plymouth is, and also its previous name, Patuxent. That's the Mayflower settling in. But let's look. This is a wider map, a bigger map. That down in the south, the bottom arrow, is Jamestown, where that was set up in Virginia. And then New Plymouth, this position, Cape Cod, is under the second A of Massachusetts. The reason why I've put this map in, because in reality, they were supposed to arrive somewhere between Chesapeake Bay in Virginia and New York. That was their destination. But because of those strong winds and storms, they ended up going further north. Captain Jones did try to make that journey much further south, nearer to where they were supposed to be headed. But the strong winds, it was just impossible. And so that's why they settled in the Cape Cod area of what is now called Massachusetts. You've most likely heard of the Plymouth Stone, which to me, reading the story and learning the story, I thought it was a huge rock where they stepped off the Mayflower and stepped on this and then onto the beach. But no, it was a case that the Mayflower had to stay offshore. And the only way that anyone could get to shore was in the small boats, in the small rowboats. And the stone that they were supposed to step down on as they came ashore was this one, which, to be honest, is only about a meter and a half at the most wide. So it wasn't as impressive as I certainly thought previously. Okay, so they anchored on the 21st of November. They had a service of thanksgiving to God for bringing them safely to America. The same number that had set off from Plymouth arrived at Cape Cod. Yes, they lost one on the way, but another one was born. On the 23rd, some of them, they went ashore for the first time. And the women folk went to wash. I don't know what they went to wash, whether it was washing themselves or washing the clothes or what, but that's what was recorded by Governor Bradford later on, that they went ashore to wash. And then they signed the Mayflower Compact. And in many ways, I feel that was one of the important reasons why the Mayflower has such an impact upon America, because of the Mayflower Compact. And also the fact that they appointed John Carver as governor. He was the first freely elected colonial governor in history. You see, with Jamestown, and if you saw the TV series a few months ago, or a couple of years ago, the governor was appointed by the Crown. Here, it was a democratic appointment. And so with the Mayflower, you had the beginnings of democracy. You had the beginnings of the American Constitution, which isn't only important in terms of America, but also across the world in terms of democratic governments. And so therefore, the Mayflower is has such an important role in history, much like the Magna Carta, the signing of the Magna Carta in England. John Carver himself actually died over that winter, along with many others, and was succeeded by William Bradford, the second governor, and that's a picture of Bradford. And so this Mayflower Compact, when you go to visit the Mayflower 2, as you go in, one of the first things you see is this. This is one of your first views of the compact. And just listening to the wording, thinking in terms of that they were deemed to be an enemy of the government, was because of not wanting anything to do. They separated themselves from the Church of England and the bishops, and that was deemed to be separating themselves from the king. But if you read the words of this, the King of England, James, they still saw him as their sovereign Lord is their sovereign king. In the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, the royal subjects of our dread sovereign, Lord King James, by the grace of God, Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, Defender of the Faith, etc. Having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith, and honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in northern parts of Virginia, do by these present, solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and of one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation and furtherance of the ends aforesaid, and by virtue hereof to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and offices from time to time, as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission in obedience. And everyone, well, by everyone, I mean all the men, signed that, both pilgrim and strangers, as they were called, those who were merchant adventurers. Yes, at the top, there's John Carver, there's William Bradford, there's Edward Winslow, there's William Brewster. But look down the page, there's Miles Standish, who was one. There's Stephen Hopkins right at the bottom. And even the very last name on there was someone who was a servant. You know, that this was an agreement between all of them. You know, you had two very different groups who had come together, and they saw that the only way that they could survive was to combine their efforts to work as one group, to work as a colony together. And that's why the New Plymouth, the Plymouth plantation, succeeded where Jamestown had real problems, as that television series illustrated. Right, they'd arrived. They'd gone off ship. They'd looked around. They looked to see what they could do, where to settle. And eventually they decided upon a certain spot. Okay, so on the 25th, William Bradford and a group of 16 men went exploring. They saw 6 tribesmen and a dog. I love this, the fact that they saw, yes, 6 tribesmen, but they also mentioned that they saw a dog as well. I don't know the name of the dog, but they saw this dog. And so almost immediately, they realized that they weren't the only ones that were there in this area. But it wasn't really until after the winter that they actually made actual real contact with the Wampanoag people who lived in that area. They also found several bags of local seed corn in an abandoned village. And right at the end of this talk, we'll come back to that abandoned village. They were still living on the Mayflower. Their exploring was to go off in small boats and to explore the land around. Then on Christmas Day, they began to build in the communal buildings, including, of course, a place of worship. But also at that time, Mrs. Bradford, who was on the Mayflower, fell overboard and was drowned. And in January, they agreed that every man would build their own homes. Now, because they ended up by being directed by the Wampanoag people, this is an artist's impression of what the first buildings that they created looked like. Now, whether that's true or not, I don't know. But eventually they did build more substantial, more European-looking buildings, as they had been used to. And today you can go to New Plymouth, you can to Plymouth Plantation, as it is set out just like this. There you can see where Governor Bradford was supposed to have lived. And just across the other side of the road, where it says N, the building described as N, is where it is thought, this is nothing definite, the possibility of where the Hopkins family lived. And then across virtually on the other side of the road are where the Brewsters live. And you can see the communal buildings there, you know, the stores, the forge, the beast house, the hay barn, you know, ovens. And then, of course, at the top of the village was the place of worship, with eventually with the fort being built on top. And when you go to New Plymouth today, that's how it's all set out, with people dressed in the outfits, the Puritan outfits of what the first settlers would have dressed in. But as I said just now, they weren't alone. The local tribe, the Wampanoag, they were from the beginning aware of them. In February, apparently some of the tools went missing. And so that particular area, they termed it as Thievish Bay. But then in March, a guy called Somerset just walks into the settlement and speaks to them in English. How has he learned English? And apparently from fishermen, from meeting with people from Jamestown, that you know, they weren't as isolated as they possibly thought they were. Well, sometime later, Somerset returns with a guy called Squanto, who was a member of the Wampanoag tribe. And this guy had been a slave in England. And when he came back to the New World, he came back with Captain John Smith, of course, you know, who was involved in the story of Pocahontas. And Squanto became very important to the settlers in New Plymouth. At some stage earlier on in 1621, they were visited by the chief, the great chief of the Wampanoags, who came with 60 of his braves to meet with the settlers and to talk to them through the interpreters. And basically, they taught the settlers how to plant the local corn, because for the first months, it was winter, they really, all they did was to build their houses. And it really was the Wampanoag who helped them settle in the way that they did. And it was Squanto who helped the settlement as teacher interpreter up to 1622, you know, 18 months, 2 years later, before he died. And so the relationship between the settlers and the Wampanoag was good. And according to history, they were invited to the first Thanksgiving, American Thanksgiving. So here's a picture, a classic picture of how that Thanksgiving, that first Thanksgiving, looked like. You can see the settlers in their Puritan outfits and the Wampanoag over on the right-hand side. But what's the reality of this? Was it really seen or deemed to be in the first Thanksgiving? Well, I think history proves that it wasn't. As one of the leaflets from the settlement puts it, the Wampanoag and English colonists did come together for at least 3 days of feasting, military exercises, and diplomacy. We know the event through a letter from 1621 that mentions that the colonists celebrated their first harvest by rejoicing in a special manner, and that at least 90 Wampanoag people joined them. But this event was a harvest celebration, not a Thanksgiving. It is not until 1841 that the event is erroneously interpreted to be the first Thanksgiving. And then as a footnote, at Plymouth Plantation, we call this event the harvest celebration in 1621. And so that's the reality of the situation. It's been, a lot of myth have ended up surrounding that first May meeting between the Wampanoag and the settlers. But before that, they had to face that first winter where they were so unprepared for it. More than 50%, and that included Governor Carver, died during that first winter, that first year. Yet when the Mayflower left in the spring of 1621, none of the pilgrims or the merchant adventurers, none wanted to return, because they realized the potential that their little colony had for the future. So what caused all those deaths? Well, generally speaking, it was put down to bad diet, inadequate shelter, lung disease, etc. However, by the following November, another ship, the Fortune, arrived. By this time, apparently, the Mayflower, when it got back within months, was just turned over to scrap. And so when the merchant adventurers sent the next ship, it wasn't the Mayflower, it was the Fortune. And because of that, the numbers were replenished with with new colonists. But where the first colonists had been families, these tended to be single young men. And this meant that by 1627, the colony consisted of 28 extended families. Now, why extended families? Well, there had been the original families of parents and children with their servants. And then, of course, rather than building separate homes for these single guys, they were brought into the families. And so therefore you had extended families living in the houses. You can see there the dates where people arrived, either 1621 on the Fortune, or 2 years later, the merchant adventurers sent another ship. And again, these are key names from a family history point of view. I don't know where they came from, but those are just I do know that those are the names of those who joined the colony by 1627. There's two there which are later, Fells and Sibsey. Apparently they didn't come on a ship. They basically just came from further down the coast and only stayed for the winter period. And one of the new guys, Nicholas Snow, who came in 1623, actually married Constance Hopkins, that's Stephen and Elizabeth Hopkins' daughter. But problems were arising further south in Jamestown. The fact that in 1622, because of the bad relationship between the settlers and the local tribes, there ended up a mass slaughter, a massacre of that original colony. It did survive, but it was deemed as the Jamestown massacre. And as a result of that, the settlement at New Plymouth had a fort built over the place of worship, over the chapel, and also a fence was put around. And one other sort of detail is that the settlement was eventually out of debt by 1648. By all accounts, there were tension between the settlers and the merchant adventurers back in London, because initially the colony did not provide any finance to replace the outlay that the merchant adventurers had made. And so tension happened between the two. But then the settlers discovered something that was greatly desired back in London especially, and that was beaver fur, beaver skins. And so a trade began within the colony, which meant that money could then, well, the skins could be sent back to the UK, and therefore the settlement eventually came out of debt. If you go to New Plymouth today, and note the spelling, very, very basic spelling. You can see the settlement, the English settlement, on the right-hand side at the top, and then the Wampanoag settlement, homestead, further down. That both are set out with people portraying the life of both groups. There. 5 years ago, because of family connections, my Cornish connections, in other words, the family came from Penryn, which was main trade there was granite. And in the end of the 19th century, the granite quarrying industry in Cornwall fell apart. And so my grandfather, virtually all of his brothers emigrated out of Cornwall. 2 went to South Wales, and the rest went to Quincy. I know it looks as though it's spelled Quincy, but it's Quincy, just south of Boston, which was known as the Granite City. And unfortunately, 20 years later, that fell as well. But I've got second cousins now. 5 years on, they are now relatives out there, are second cousins once removed. But there was quite a lot of Mormontons in that, were in that area because of this. And we went to visit, and to visit these cousins. And as we were so close, we did take a coach tour to visit Plymouth, Mayflower 2, and other things in that area. And so I took these pictures of the settlement as it is now for visitors. Inside the buildings as well, you could wander in and out, and there were people in the outfits and speaking in a very peculiar form of English. And inside the fort as well. And then of course the Wampanoag village and descendants of the tribe, showing the lifestyle and the crafts that of that tribe. And both those who represented the English settlers and the descendants of the Wampanoag, showing the two lifestyles of these two groups who really got on well. And from there, we travelled up to where Mayflower 2 is now moored. And this, of course, was, built in 1957, when I was just 7 years of age, at Brixham, and then sailed across thereafter. And there again, you got people dressed as sailors on board, you know, talking about the ship and life on board ship. And then you could go down into the hold and see the cramped condition that those the settlers would have had when they went across the Atlantic in the Mayflower. And then the third part of that day trip was to go and visit the monument dedicated to those first pilgrims, to those on board the Mayflower. National monument to the forefathers erected by the grateful people in remembrance of their labor, sacrifices, and suffering for the cause of civil and religious liberty. And then the names of those who were aboard the Mayflower. And on each side of the monument were the basis for community, for the Plymouth plantation, but also became part of the life of America as a whole: morality, law, education, and liberty. And then around the monument as well were reliefs telling the story. There presumably are the pilgrims leaving Boston, escaping to Holland. And there they are coming ashore in New Plymouth. And also the relationship between the settlers and the Wampanoag, that both groups realized that they needed each other. The settlers to help them settle in and to find it and make their new life work, and the Wampanoag because of persecution from other tribes, if you like. And so the two groups really gelled in a way that Jamestown never knew. And then finally, of course, the signing of the Mayflower Compact, the beginnings of American democracy and worldwide democracy. We have to admit that as they settled in, they made this covenant together to make a go of their colony. And I suppose one sad thing is I came across this plaque in memory of the Wampanoag of Patuxet, who perished in the Great Dying Plague of 1616 to 1619, introduced by European and English invaders. The decimated village of Patuxet, a graveyard, was settled by the Pilgrims who arrived on the Mayflower in 1620. They renamed the village Plymouth Colony. Because this year is the 400th anniversary of the sailing of the Mayflower, there are numerous websites around which gives far more detail of the story of the Mayflower. And events have been held over the summer, over the autumn, and summer and autumn in Plymouth, in Southampton, as well as in Massachusetts. And so that's the story of the Mayflower, and also for us as family historians, the possibility of drawing links between our family tree and those involved in the Mayflower. Thank you.